Hello, I'm Roger Watson and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education and Practice, and welcome to this session on organising a manuscript. By organising a manuscript, I mean what goes where under which headings and subheadings. To find that out, you need to check the journal guidance. It does differ slightly between journals. If it's not clear there, then check an issue of the journal and you'll soon see what the headings and subheadings are that are required. I'm going to use a fairly generic model here to illustrate what goes where under the various headings. I'm also going to look at some other aspects of presentation in this session too. So I hope you find this useful. A typical order of contents of a journal could look something like this: a title, an abstract, introduction and background, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, and references. As I say, please check the specific guidance for any journal to which you're submitting. These headings and subheadings and the normal order of contents, sometimes the order changes slightly in some journals too, just be aware, but this is the usual order. They're there to do two things. They're there to help you to write the article, and they're there to help the reader understand where to find relevant parts of the material. First of all, and we'll run through this in order, the title should be as short as possible, and it should also clearly be related to the topic of the paper. Try not to be too clever, literary, or obscure. Also try to put the vital information about the study at the beginning of the title. For example, a systematic review of traditional Chinese medicine is better than traditional Chinese medicine, a systematic review. People will be looking for systematic reviews. They'll already be in the area of traditional Chinese medicine. Much better to put that right at the front. A randomized control of traditional Chinese medicine versus conventional medicine. That's better than traditional Chinese medicine versus conventional medicine, a randomized controlled trial. So try to get the vital information, which is usually the design of the study, at the front of the title. This apparently makes the article more searchable on Google. The abstract should be structured. For my current journal, it's up to 400 words, but you can make it shorter. And a typical structure of an abstract is as follows: aims, background, design, methods, results, and conclusions. So for the aims, sometimes called aims and objectives, an example would be aim to investigate the quality of life of clients. The objectives would be what you're going to do on the way: to provide a profile of the quality of life of clients, then to examine the relationships between quality of life and socio-demographic factors. That's just one example. Writing the abstract is very important. I'm going to look now briefly at keywords and discoverability. First step is construct a clear and descriptive title. Reiterate key phrases. Try to achieve congruence in these between the title and the abstract and the keywords. And I'm just going to show you examples here of what I mean. This is an example of a well-optimized abstract, in other words, one that makes use of the principles outlined in the previous slide. I'm not going to read this all in detail, I'll just put it up and then we'll try to show you why it's well optimized. There's a title, aim, background, methods, results, and conclusions. The title is a review of false memory in older adults. And what I've done here is to try and get the words false memory and older adults in as much as I can. And the keywords are memory, false memory, and older adults. Of course, you can have more. And here in red, we see the relationship between the different aspects of the title and the abstract and the keywords, and there are 18 terms in common. And again, this makes it more searchable on search engines and on Google, for example. This, on the other hand, is a poorly optimized abstract. And it's poorly optimized because there are only 9 terms in common. I've tried to mix them up and not repeat the phrases like false memory and older people. I've used senior population in the title, and I haven't used any of these words in the keywords. So that's a poorly optimized abstract, less easy to find on search engines. So this is something that's worth paying attention to when you write an abstract for an article. Remember, people tend to search for specifics, for example, children's nurses and not nurses. Ensure the title contains the most important words that relate to the topic. Key phrases, of course, need to make sense within the title and the abstract and flow well. They can't be used gratuitously. Best to focus on a maximum of 3 or 4 different keywords. Don't try to get across too many points. And then, of course, finally, check that the abstract reads well once you've constructed it. Now, looking at the sections of the manuscript, the main sections. The introduction places the study in context, and that context can be policy, practice, research, or education. Sometimes with clinical subjects like nursing, it can be all of these. Should contain a problem statement. So what's the problem you're looking at? Why is the problem worth studying? Why are you studying the problem? And why would anyone be interested? So try to grab the attention of the reader in the introduction. If the journal doesn't ask for an introduction specifically or only asks for a background, do try to make sure that the beginning of the background section reads like an introduction. The background to the study is essentially a literature review, not a systematic literature review, but it looks at the main aspects of the literature that are of interest to your study and support your study. Here you should try to demonstrate what's already known about the topic and what gaps your paper will fill, and identifies the questions to be addressed in the paper. And you should try to end with a research question, or in some cases perhaps a hypothesis. I'm sure you all know what a question is. It's something that ends with a question mark, but when people are asked to construct research questions, very often they don't. They restate the aims or they construct a statement. A research question should be a clear statement in the form of a question of what you set out to investigate. Here are some examples. Are practice nurses better than GPs at removing earwax? Does continuing professional development improve nurses' management skills? Why do older nurses leave the profession? These are all very different kinds of questions. One's comparison, one's sort of exploratory, the other one's about sort of cause and effect. So They're all very different, but they're all questions, and it lets the reader know, and particularly it lets the editor know exactly what it is you're setting out to do. The research question will also dictate the methods and the subsequent analysis that you use. So a research question differs from a hypothesis. A hypothesis is, for example, there will be a relationship between X and Y. There will be a difference between X and Y. X will be better than Y at. The thing about hypotheses is that they are specifically testable by statistical means. Of course, hypotheses don't apply to qualitative research. I'm looking here at quantitative research. Having said that, qualitative research should also always contain a research question, as should a systematic review. So once you've written the introduction and background and stated your research question, then the methods. So here you need to cover the design, the methods, which includes the sample, data collection and analysis, and even some consideration here of the ethics. In terms of design, they can be either qualitative or quantitative, and they can be done cross-sectionally or longitudinally. So under quantitative, you would have things like RCTs and surveys. Under qualitative, you might have ethnographies or grounded theories. These are not exhaustive. So you need to state broadly which area of research you're in and then specify the design, and then whether it's being done once or on a longitudinal basis. And a description of the design will dictate the subsequent methods and, of course, the analysis that you use. In terms of sampling, you've got to state the population from which it was drawn, what were your inclusion and exclusion criteria, how were people included or excluded from your sample. So the population may be all of the patients in a hospital on a particular day, and the inclusion criteria may be patients with heart failure. The exclusion may be patients with respiratory problems, for example. Then you need to state the type of sampling and how you got access to the participants. This is important. This is part of the ethics as well, but you've also got to consider that if you were given direct access to patients, that's very different from being given indirect access to patients. Indirect access could bias the study. For example, managers may only select certain nurses to answer a questionnaire on how satisfied they are working in a hospital, for example. So you need to make all of these things clear. Reviewers often say, I don't know what the author has done here, and that's a common reason for revision or even rejection of manuscripts. So think about how someone reading this will read it. Can they understand it? And of course, the ultimate scientific principle, could they go and repeat it based on what you've told them about the design and the sample? Types of sampling, state it clearly. Is it random, simple random or cluster, or stratified? And then is it sequential or convenience sampling, for example? Don't say it's one type of sampling if it's not. Don't say it's random if it's convenience, for example, because people need to know how far, the extent to which they can generalize your results. And also some sample size considerations. So you have to explain why you selected that sample. Did you simply take all of the available population? Did you take a sample? Was it sampled for looking for differences, as in a randomized controlled trial, or was it sampled for representativeness? So you need to mention power analysis and sample size calculations. In terms of data collection, if it's quantitative, which instruments did you use? Why did you use them, or did you develop one of your own? State something about the validity and the reliability in quantitative research. Is it already established or did you check it? For qualitative research, what were your criteria for ensuring rigor? That's very important. Confirmability and so forth. Do make some statement about that. And if you're using questionnaires, how were they translated? Were they already translated? Or if you translated them, what processes did you use? For reliability, say something about the reliability. You won't necessarily look at all these forms of reliability, but the possibilities are internal consistency, test-retest, intra-rater, and inter-rater reliability. In terms of validity, how was this approached in quantitative research? What we want to get is some idea of construct validity. Was this approached through content, criterion, discriminant, or factorial, for example? There are different forms of validity. Just make some statement about that as well. For the analysis, specify, of course, the statistical tests used and also state which statistical packages were used. For the results, very important just to state them and not to start discussing them. This is a common problem. And in qualitative research, well, there has been a habit in the past of combining the results with the discussion. Most qualitative researchers now say that the results should be separated out from the discussion. So this applies equally to quantitative and to qualitative research. Give, again, for quantitative, the descriptive statistics, followed by the inferential statistics, and followed by the multivariate statistics if you used multivariate statistics. Try to report them in a logical order. For qualitative research, clearly, you'll also have to give the demographics, but you won't be using any inferential or multivariate statistics. So you'd normally, in both types of study, have a table showing you what the demographics, the age, the gender, specialities, or diagnosis of the participants in the study were. And make sure that you refer to all tables and figures, another common error. And if you're asked to revise a paper and remove sections or change the order of the sections, when you submit your revision, make sure that the tables and figures are still referred to and referred to in the correct order. Table 2 shouldn't be referred to before Table 1. Tables and figures, these form a part of both qualitative and quantitative manuscripts, but an essential part of quantitative manuscripts. You may have a demographic table in a qualitative study, and you may have a figure representing the results. In terms of quantitative data, I would tend towards tables rather than figures. For example, I would always go for raw numbers in a table rather than, for example, a bar chart. However, figures in quantitative research can be useful if you're trying to present trends. It's probably the only way that you can do that. So do think, do you need a table or a figure? Why do you need a figure which might be difficult to draw and expensive to produce when you can use a table? The other thing that you must do is make sure that you don't use both to represent the same data. And try not to state all of the quantitative data in the results and then put it all in a table. Everything needs to be in the table, but draw attention in the results to the highlights in the table. If in any doubt, see how others present these. Have a look in the journal and see how others have presented your kind of data. Don't use raw statistical outputs, for example, from SPSS. These are no use for publication. You can use SPSS to produce fairly serviceable tables. Frankly, I think you're better off just starting again and drawing them yourself. Try to be parsimonious, try to get as much into tables as possible, but also try to make it comprehensible. And think, do you need a table? Can you append or can you put the material online? and this is becoming increasingly common. And some journals limit you to the number of tables and figures, or tables or figures, that you can use. Here's an example of a figure which is just hopeless, no good for publication at all. It is meaningful. It describes the relationships between military and aid groups and government groups and NGOs in Afghanistan, but it's just too much to take in. So I'd really try to avoid very highly complex figures like that. Here's a reasonable table, but it's actually very difficult to read this. The data are presented in slightly different ways, and it's just not neat at all. As I say, it does mean something, and you can extract the data from it, but I'm pretty sure that there would be a better way of presenting this. I think this is an excellent table because it's got a purely descriptive title, which actually tells you about the research question. It's got years along the top and the national totals and percentages, and it's got those who favour, oppose or don't know the answer to the question down below. Very easy to see, and down below it's got the demographics in terms of the gender and the age and where people live. So this is a really good example of a highly informative, parsimonious table. It stands alone. You don't need reference to anything else to interpret the data. Of course, you won't always be able to present this kind of table with your data, but that is a good example of a nice, parsimonious and very clear table. Once the results are presented, then it's time to prepare your discussion. And I always use the metaphor here of closing the circle. The discussion should in some ways take you back to the beginning of the paper, remind you what the study was about, why you did it and what you found out, and then go on to describe why it's important, related to the literature, and really what it means and how it can be useful. So discuss the findings to the research questions. Don't discuss anything else. Do include the limitations of your study in here, probably under a separate subheading. Don't overstate the findings, just be absolutely clear about them. There's a habit of overstating findings. Don't say how interesting they are or how important they are. Just state them in very modest terms. Let other people draw their conclusions from it. And also try to draw out, and this is easier for clinical subjects like ours, draw out the implications and the recommendations for the policy, practice, or whatever area you were outlining in the introduction. So if this was aimed at policy, what are the implications for policy? And relate back to the aims of the study. How well were these achieved? Finally, the conclusion, and the conclusion really is, as it says in the diagram, so the point is. It's not a second abstract, it's not a restatement of the whole paper. Here you're trying to draw out the main points. Essentially, and to be frank, somebody should be able to read your abstract and your conclusions and learn almost anything and everything that they need to know about your study. Brief summary of what the paper shows, the main implications, a statement on future lines of inquiry, no references, no new ideas, and do use bullet points in the conclusion. I think they're an excellent idea. People are often curious about how long the sections of a paper should be. There's no answer to this, but I think it's a matter of making them relative to one another. And here's some ideas for a typical 5,000 word research paper. Do bear in mind that some journals have different word lengths. So for 5,000 word paper, I think the introduction could be about 500 words and the background about 1,000. Methods shouldn't take too much room unless they're very intricate and unusual. 500 words should do. Results, again, as short and snappy as possible, around 500 words. Leave room for your discussion of around 2,000 words. And perhaps a conclusion of 500 words or less. I'm not saying that these are absolute. I'm just saying that if you, for example, wrote a 2,000 word background, you'd have to make some compromises elsewhere. So these are just a rough idea. I emphasize just a rough idea, and they add up to a total of 5,000 words. I'd like to draw your attention to Nurse, Author and Editor, edited by Leslie Nichol on behalf of the International Association of Nursing Editors and supported by Wiley. The best thing about Nurse, Author and Editor is it's free. You can access the content directly, or you can also subscribe by putting an email address into the box and getting alerts when new content comes out, but you can access the material directly. It's mainly written by editors and it covers some fairly prosaic aspects of writing for publication. For example, how to start an introduction, how to start a discussion, what should go in an abstract. Very, very straightforward advice on aspects of writing manuscripts, but also some higher level concepts such as open access and open science and predatory journals. Anyway, I would really strongly recommend that you check out Nurse, Author and Editor and get the alerts to the content. That's my email address if you've any comments or questions. If you want to check my own publication and research record, you can do that on ORCID. You can follow me on Twitter, or you can connect with me on WeChat. I hope you found that session useful. Once again, thank you very much for listening.